In 1500, over 200,000 people braved roads ravaged by war to travel to the eternal city of Rome. In that year, a jubilee had been declared by Pope Alexander VI, following the newly arrived at custom of holding such an event every 25 years. The first of these had been observed in 1350, and now 150 years later, the sixth occurrence was marked by new ceremonies that would become part of every jubilee thereafter, until the reforms of Pope Paul VI in 1975. Drawn loosely from the Jewish practice of releasing slaves from their bondage and returning property to its original family owners every 50 years, the Catholic Jubilee called the faithful to a season of repentance and restoration in the cycles of fasting and feasting found in the liturgical calendar that had taken form over the centuries. As part of the various observances, the pontiff would bestow gifts upon those he felt had served the faith in a particularly beneficial way. And in 1500, there was much to celebrate. Since the last Jubilee in 1475, the Spanish kingdoms had been brought together under Ferdinand and Isabella, and the Muslims had been expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. In 1492, Columbus had sailed west and had discovered something wholly unexpected, an entirely new world filled with riches unimagined and souls to be brought to the faith. The civil war over who would wear the English crown was settled, and other than the seemingly endless wars between France and the various political entities of Italy, most of Latin Europe was, at least at the moment, free from war. And so it was that the pilgrims streamed to participate in the religious observances held throughout the year. Most of those who spent time in the city did so unaware of the machinations and scandals that swirled through the uppermost strata of the intertwined societies of church, state, and wealth. Yet at this time, the papacy lived at the intersection of all three, as it was occupied by the paterfamilias of one of the wealthiest families of all of Europe. While known officially as Alexander VI, the Pope's given name was Roderick Borgia. Elected as Bishop of the Holy See in the same year as Columbus would discover the Bahamas and Cuba, Roderick, now Alexander, had been rumored to have bought the office with donkey loads of silver. He promoted to high church office members of his family so as to establish a nearly hereditary claim to the papacy. Yet even as he treated the church as his own personal fiefdom, he advanced learning and scholarship within its clergy and sought to create peaceful relations throughout Europe. Among the throngs that converged on Rome were two very different men who would have an enormous effect on the course of life in Europe before the next Jubilee would come around. One was a serious and tormented young monastic from the German city of Wittenberg. Upon his arrival, he was immediately put off by the pageantry associated with what he thought would be a time of solemn reflection and renunciation of the temptations of this world. As he saw the lavish gifts the pontiff heaped upon his illegitimate children, the monk's discomfort would turn to disgust, something that would fester for the next 17 years. The other man was a dashing dilettante from northern Europe, near where the Teutonic Knights had been settled after the Crusades. While we don't know what his reaction was to the extravagance, we do know that he did give lectures in mathematics and astronomy to the learned men of the day in the city, something that spoke to his advanced learning and intellectual ability. After their visits in the year of the Jubilee, each would soon return to their homes and take on the roles expected of them. For each, however, their time in Italy fundamentally changed their view of the world. These changes would lead one to challenge the central role of the Church and the Pope in the economy of salvation, while the other would move the earth from the center of creation to just being another planet spinning on its axis and whirling through space in revolution around the sun. Neither man set out to overthrow the structures of medieval Europe, but the forces Martin Luther and Nicolas Copernicus loosed in their lifetimes would change the Western world in ways neither could have imagined. In this episode of the Odyssey, we'll explore what brought about these changes and how they work themselves out in the world outside the limited spheres of each man.
Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. Scientific Odyssey is a mini-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery.
Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 13, Revolution of the Spheres. So here we are, at the cusp of what is generally thought to be the scientific revolution. As I hope you've seen, this revolution didn't just appear out of nothing, but rather from a series of advances in knowledge at the end of the Middle Ages that were tied to changes in the political world in which the science took place. As we go forward, I hope that you'll keep this interaction in mind. Science doesn't happen in a vacuum, and its entanglement in this case with the broad currents in European religion and politics will be an important factor in what happens, where it happens, and why it happens when it does. It's a complex story, and while we'll certainly focus on the science, it will be impossible not to venture into other areas from time to time. Of course, if you're a long-time listener of this podcast, that's likely not a surprise to you, nor is it likely to put you off. That having been said, the scientific contributions of Copernicus are tied to his life amongst those currents, perhaps even more than most of the other figures we will discuss. As such, it will be illustrative to talk both about his science and the events of his life that influenced his science. Doing this, however, will be a bit tricky, as they also intertwine. So what I think I'm going to try and do is start by giving you an overview of Copernicus's life in this episode, with the main focus being on the heliocentric model of the solar system he develops. I will then go back and cover in greater detail the biographical specifics and how they led to his science in the next episode. One last note before we jump in. This may not be the story you're familiar with. In fact, if you're not pretty into the history of astronomy, I'm going to guess that what you're about to hear is not the story you've heard before. I tell you this because what I relay to you may cause a bit of cognitive dissonance, as it doesn't match up with what you expect. Don't worry though, I'll explain what's going on and why it's going on so you'll understand what the real story is. And I guarantee it'll be better than the old story you've likely heard. So okay, let's get on with the show. Nicolas Copernicus was born on February 19th, 1473 in the town of Torun, near the Baltic Sea in Northern Europe. And this is where we actually run right into our first misconception about the life of the man. Copernicus, or Copernicus as he would soon become known, is often said in popular books on this subject to be Polish. The truth is that the situation is a good bit more complicated than that, as Torun was actually part of what we might call today a semi-autonomous region, loosely affiliated with several political entities, but that was run by an ecclesial hierarchy of the Catholic Church in the region. I'll delve into the details next week, but there is a case that could be made to call him a Prussian, or as being from someplace like Pomerania, but probably the most accurate thing to say would be that he was a Varmian. His family, by the time he was born, was well established in the burgher class of the region as merchants and administrators, and as was often the case, that wealth associated with the activity attracted an eye of a member of the nobility of the region. Copernicus's father, also named Nicholas, married into the Watson-Rode family. The Watson-Rodes were part of the elite ruling class of this region, although this oversight was exercised through the office of the region's bishop rather than through some noble titles such as Duke or Count. Nicholas Sr. and his wife Barbara had 4 children, of whom Nicholas the younger was the youngest. When the older Copernicus died, something that happened with little Nicholas was about 10. His maternal uncle took the family in and in due time provided for the children's education. This began at the grammar school of Torun, soon to be followed by a sort of prep school. There is no sense that Nicholas really excelled in either of these places, And we don't get any sort of a record of that his fascination with astronomy would begin here. More than anything, it seems like that he was the nephew of the most powerful man in town, and so he spent his time engaged in the activities of a young man with few needs or cares in the world. In due time, Copernicus was sent off to the University of Krakow to begin his more formal education, as was the custom, and it is here that we see one of the fundamental realities of Copernicus's life take form. From a very early age, likely from the time that he showed any level of intellectual talent, he was groomed to take a very specific role, that of an administrator of the region within the church-based hierarchy that was responsible for seeing that things proceeded in an orderly and proper fashion. In 1491, at the relatively late age of 19, he and his brother enrolled, and it is here that we find him really becoming interested in astronomy. Krakow is known for its dedication to the sciences, and it boasted 2 chairs in astronomy at a time when many of the Central and Northern European schools had none. One of the lovely circumstances of history here is that we still have most of the library of books Copernicus accumulated over his lifetime. Captured by forces in the employ of the Swedish crown during the 30 Years' War, the books escaped the various waves of sacking, looting, and destruction that accompanied the many wars of Europe by being safely ensconced in Sweden, which was mostly untouched in these conflicts. As such, we have the books he bought at various points in his life. During his years in Krakow, Copernicus is known to have purchased Feuerbach's New Theory and the Alphonsen Tables, and took at least 7 classes in the fields of astronomy and mathematics. The foremost astronomer at Krakow was a man who had been the student of Regiomontes by the name of Adalbert of Brudenzo. Adalbert was no longer a teacher, and he didn't teach any courses, as he had reached some sort of a point of semi-retirement. But he kept his notes and his manuscripts in Krakow's library, and so these formed the core of the curriculum there. In addition, he hosted Saturday discussions in his home, conversations Copernicus certainly would have attended and participated in. It was during Copernicus' time of study in Krakow that Columbus would sail to the New World, a feat that fired imaginations all across Europe, and that we know made a specific impression on Copernicus himself. The reports of Columbus's voyage set off a huge interest in the fields of cartography, astronomy, and the related field of what's known as cosmography, which is a discipline that combined the two to produce maps and models of all creation. Also, during these years, there were a number of very notable astronomical events, including the appearance of a number of comets and the occurrence of several eclipses, both solar and lunar. The measurement of these phenomena was aided by the arrival of a set of new instruments from a wealthy alumnus of the university, who had also gone on to study under Regiomonte while in Hungary. Copernicus left Krakow in 1495 after 4 years of study. It's not known if he actually completed his baccalaureate degree there, as we have no record of that happening, but I think it's somewhat hard to imagine him not doing so, especially as he was accepted for study a year later at one of Italy's premier institutions, the University of Bologna. Copernicus had chosen to attend there in order to study law as part of the path into the family business of civil administration. He was, for all practical purposes, following in the footsteps of his uncle, who had done the exact same thing. However, when he arrived, it's pretty clear that he was there as much to study astronomy as law. His arrival in 1496 corresponded with the first publication of Regiomonte's Epitome of the Almagest, and the book would have had a profound influence on Copernicus, as it was likely the first time he had really seen the Ptolemaic system laid out quite so clearly. Additionally, we know he read the work of influential astronomer Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who stridently attacked astrology on some rather interesting grounds. As we mentioned in an earlier episode of this series, the order of the planets in Ptolemy's system wasn't really well established, specifically the order of Mercury and Venus. Ptolemy had taken an educated guess and placed Mercury closer to the Earth at the center of the cosmos, but it was little more than that. Mirandola quite correctly asked how astronomy could be trusted if no one really even knew which planets were closest and thus most influential. This argument may have had a significant impact on Copernicus' thinking as the years went on. When he moved to Bologna, Copernicus had rented a room from the city's foremost astronomer, Domenico Maria Novara, another former student of Regiomonte's. Novara was a surprisingly original thinker who questioned the Earth's complete stillness on the basis of the observation of the precession of the equinox, something Copernicus would likely have heard more than once in the evening observing sessions the two men conducted together. In their collaboration, while Novara was clearly the master, Copernicus was more than just a pupil, but instead he acted as a trusted observing assistant, working to establish and verify the observations being made. It was during his time in Bologna that Copernicus would have traveled to Rome to attend the Jubilee observance there. While visiting the city, he claims to have given lectures in mathematics and probably astronomy that were attended by many notable men in the academic community. If this is true, and there's really no reason to think otherwise, it gives an indication of the stature Copernicus was held in by the academic community of Italy. Following this, Copernicus returned to Varmia to formally take up an office that he had been granted a few years earlier. While there, he asked for permission to return to Italy to study medicine at the University of Padua, a request that was granted. Upon his return, he studied there, taking courses on medicinal astrology and learning the ideas of Galen and Avicenna. In 1503, he would finally conclude his education by taking a doctorate in canon law from the University of Ferrara, and then he would return to Varmia to stay. Before we leave this introduction to Copernicus's academic preparation, I have to say that I've spent a little time trying to figure out why Copernicus spent 12 years getting an education. While it's not completely uncommon these days to take that long to earn a doctorate in the sciences from the time you first enroll in college until you graduate with that PhD, in an age when lifespans were often not much longer than 35 or 40 years as we've seen, that's an eternity. As we've discussed, if you take out the time to get through the trivium, the curriculum usually was completed in under 8 years. So what do we make of this? Part of me sort of wants to think of Copernicus as some sort of 16th century dilettante, a bit of a rich kid who wanted to go and hang out in all of the cool places before finally settling down. And to be honest, I think there's probably some truth in that. I also think that when he got to Italy, there might have been just a little bit of reluctance to leave because of the higher standing of living and, more importantly probably, the much better weather. I mean, given the choice, would you rather live near the warm Mediterranean with frequently sunny skies, or on the cold and stormy Baltic Sea with its long gray winters with short days and interminable nights? And please, my apologies to my listeners in Germany. Finally, though, I think there was what I call a medieval-modern dynamic playing out here. From the time of Diocletian, emperor of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, there had been laws that either strongly encouraged or required sons to take up their father's trade and station in life. One of the consequences of the plagues that had swept Europe was to loosen these restrictions, but in the intervening 1,000 years from Diocletian to the 15th century disruptions, they had become really culturally ingrained. Copernicus's uncle was a wealthy ecclesial administrator that more or less ran the part of the world Copernicus was from. It was expected that the younger man would do the same, and a lot of resources were expended to see that this happened. It was the medieval way things had been done for centuries. But what if Copernicus wanted a different life? What if he wanted a life of astronomy and observation and late nights in an observatory with an armillary sphere and a quadrant? I can see that as creating quite a tension within him, and it leading to more than just a little bit of foot dragging on his part. Nevertheless, in 1503, with a newly minted doctorate of canon law, the rich young man returned home to take his place in the family enterprise of overseeing the administration of Varmia, a role he would keep for the rest of his life. After leaving Italy in 1503, Copernicus returned home to take up the position for which he had been groomed for the last 12 years. With him, he brought a deep understanding of the law, economics, medicine, and of course astronomy. However, he also had obligations. Specifically, he had to show something for all of the money that had been invested in him. As a result, he became his uncle's secretary. His uncle held the position of the Bishop of Varmia and was the leader of the council that administered the region under the nominal authority of the Polish crown. Copernicus's position was a somewhat prestigious one, and it could be said that he was being groomed to take over for his uncle one day. But it also amounted to something that was little more than indentured servitude. He had little independence, and thus his time to pursue his researches would have been somewhat limited. And this is where he differed from the predecessors that we've discussed. Unlike Puribach and Regiomonte, Copernicus never occupied an academic position that would have allowed him uninterrupted time to work on his ideas in astronomy. What's also interesting here is that we have no record of him being offered a position at one of the universities, something odd given the reputation as a first-rate astronomer he had built during his years in Italy. While we don't know why, I suspect that it had to do with the fact that he was expected to return to Varmia and take up his position there. One other thing that we really don't have a good idea about is what took place during all those years in Varmia. In fact, unlike other famous figures we'll encounter, we don't really know much about the astronomical work Copernicus did for most of the remainder of his life, because he didn't really keep a journal or a notebook of his thoughts. Unlike his contemporaries, Da Vinci and Luther, his interior intellectual life lacks documentation. What we basically get are a few notes on the blank pages at the back of some of his astronomy texts, and 3 documents that will emerge from Varmia, one early-ish in his time there, and the other 2 very near the end of his life. What should be understood here is that the best way to think of these is that they're really the tip of the iceberg of his deep intellectual processes. The notes themselves are difficult to date, but the first seems to date from a series of planetary conjunctions in February of 1504. In these, he notes that the position of 2 of the planets predicted by the Alphonsine tables are off by 1 or 2 degrees. This shows us that he's taking clear measurements of things in the sky while serving as his uncle's secretary. The second set of notes is undateable, though some historians of science suggest that they were written after he left the service of his uncle in 1510. These notes are a table of the sizes of the various planetary spheres from Ptolemy's Almagest. It seems that at this point, Copernicus is working towards seeing a commonality in the data that would suggest perhaps the orbital size of the Earth. But it should be understood these notes can't be really thought of as some sort of a eureka moment. Now, as I just mentioned, in 1510, Copernicus leaves the position in his uncle's service, possibly as he's disliked the man who he may have feared and resented for forcing him into the life he was now committed to. During his time in Italy, he had been appointed one of the 16 what are called canon lawyers for the region, a position that had come with a salary and some other sources of income. But now it required him to live in the town of Frombork on the shores of the Baltic Sea if he were not engaged in the service of the region in some other capacity. Frombork was the ecclesial seat of the entire region, and all of the canons would have had quarters in the town fortress as well as in the town itself. Sometime within the next 4 years, Copernicus produced a little-known work that was circulated among his friends. And here's where we come to the second point of misconception in our story. Often, when you hear of Copernicus's work, there's only one book mentioned, On the Revolution of the Spheres. This is the book that most completely laid out his heliocentric model, and most narratives focus on it like it's some sort of a bolt of lightning that no one expected. And that's a really exciting story, but it's wrong. In the years between 1510 and 1514, Copernicus actually put out a short work that more or less completely outlined the basics of a model where the Earth moved around the Sun, indicating that he'd actually made the intellectual jump to heliocentrism much earlier than is usually explained in the typical narrative. The reason we know that it had to have been done before 1514 is that we have a reference to it as an untitled anonymous set of folios in the library of the astronomer Matthew of Machau, who had been one of Copernicus' professors in Krakow. This document makes it very clear that by this time, Copernicus has shifted over to considering a model where the sun resides at the center of the universe. Now, as I mentioned, the work is untitled, but when put out, it will eventually be given the name of Commentariolus, or the Little Commentary, by the later astronomer Tycho Brahe, and that's what we'll call it here. Historians don't really have a firm grasp of what caused Copernicus to make the jump to heliocentrism, but there are a few clues. First, we know that he detested Ptolemy's use of the equant, as it negated Aristotle's principle of uniform circular motions for objects in the celestial realm. We'll talk about this a little more in greater detail later in the episode. Second, he may have been trying to eliminate some of the ad hoc pieces of the geocentric model, as well as explain certain synchronicities of the motions of the superior planets. Third, when he considered a heliocentric solution, there were certain pieces of information that naturally fell out of the model that Ptolemy's model just didn't produce. The most important of these was the order of the planets, thus creating for the first time a true solar system. So let's take a look at the Commentariolus, and let's do it by actually listening to Copernicus's own words. Quote, "Our predecessors assumed, I observe, a large number of celestial spheres, mainly for the purpose of explaining the planet's apparent motion by the principle of uniformity. For they thought it altogether absurd that a heavenly body, which is perfectly spherical, should not always move uniformly. By connecting and combining uniform motions in various ways, they had seen they could make any body appear to move in any position. Callippus and Eudoxus, who tried to achieve this result by means of concentric circles, could not thereby account for all of the planetary movements, not merely the apparent revolutions of those bodies, but also their ascent, as it seems to us, at some times, and descent at others, a pattern entirely incompatible with the principle of concentricity. Therefore, for this purpose, it seemed better to employ eccentrics and epicycles, a system which most scholars finally accepted. Yet the widespread planetary theories, advanced by Ptolemy and most other astronomers, although consistent with the numerical data, seemed likewise to present no small difficulty. For these theories were not adequate unless they also conceived certain equalizing circles, which made the planet appear to move at all times with uniform velocity, neither on its own deferent sphere nor about its own epicycle sphere. Hence, this sort of notion seemed neither sufficiently absolute nor sufficiently pleasing to the mind. Therefore, having become aware of these defects, I often considered whether there could perhaps be found a more reasonable arrangement of circles, from which every apparent irregularity could be derived, while everything in itself would move uniformly, as is required by the rule of perfect motion. After I had attacked this very difficult and almost insoluble problem, the suggestion at length came to me how it could be solved with fewer and much more suitable constructions than were formerly put forward, if some postulates, which are called axioms, were granted me." End quote. Now, I will hope that you'll forgive me this very long quotation I just read you, but I just thought it was really, really cool to listen to the words of a man as he wrote them 500 years ago, and to recognize just how insightful and, just clear that they are. I think it's just unbelievable. It's just neat to reach back across that time. So, from this introduction, what he then goes on to do is he puts forward 7 postulates about the construction of the universe. And so I want to read those to you if I can. So, here are his postulates. 1. There is no center of all the celestial orbs or spheres. 2. The center of the earth is the center, not of the universe, but only of gravity and the lunar sphere. 3. All of the spheres encircle the sun, which is, as it were, in the middle of them all, so that the center of the universe is near the sun. 4. The ratio of the earth's distance from the sun to the height of the firmament is so much smaller than the ratio of the Earth's radius to its distance from the sun that the distance between the Earth and the sun is imperceptible in comparison with the loftiness of the firmament. 5. Whatever motion appears in the firmament is due not to it, but to the Earth. Accordingly, the Earth, together with the circumjacent elements, performs a complete rotation on its fixed poles in a daily motion, while the firmament and highest heaven abide unchanged. 6. What appear to us as motions of the sun are due not to its motion, but to the motion of the Earth and our sphere, with which we revolve about the sun as we would with any other planet. The Earth has, then, more than one motion. 7. What appears in the planets as the alternation of retrograde and direct motion is due not to their motion, but to the Earth's. The motion of the Earth alone, therefore, suffices to explain so many apparent irregularities in the heaven. Now, as you can see, these are pretty revolutionary ideas, and before we spend a bit of time unpacking them, let me make just a few comments. First, this document was not really meant to be a scientific document. In it, Copernicus states what he thinks is true, but he doesn't offer much in the way of evidence. The model has a certain level of self-consistency, and any of the recipients who read it would have recognized that it did explain many of the observed motions of the planets in a more intuitive way, assuming, of course, one could accept that the Earth could in fact move. This is intentional. As Copernicus states later, quote, "However, I have thought it well, for the sake of brevity, to omit from this sketch mathematical demonstrations, reserving those for my larger work." End quote. In other words, Copernicus has at least some of the math worked out, but he doesn't want to burden his audience with it yet. Second, this was not a printed document, but rather a manuscript, which meant that there weren't a lot of copies circulating around. Copernicus created it to share with a few trusted friends who could offer some constructive feedback without exposing him to any embarrassment if he had made some very obvious mistake. This fear of embarrassment is something that we'll return to soon before the episode is over. Nevertheless, the document will make the rounds fairly quickly and may be a part of why in 1514 Copernicus is invited by Pope Leo X to come to Rome to participate in the on-again, off-again efforts at calendar reform. Copernicus declines this invitation for reasons we don't know, as we do not have the letter he sent in reply. Third, it's pretty clear that at least part of the motivation for this has to do with Copernicus's distaste for Ptolemy's use of the equant. And let's take a moment with that last point. We really don't know a lot about Copernicus' thought process in making the transition from an Earth-centered or geocentric model of the universe to a sun-centered or heliocentric solar system. Therefore, we're left to try to read between the lines and look over his correspondence or the ideas of his teachers and colleagues that he may have been responding to. From what I've been able to gather from my research, I think it's this problem with Ptolemy's use of an equant point that may have been the motivation behind Copernicus's initial work. Like so many others steeped in an Aristotelian paradigm, the idea that the spheres of the heavens wouldn't turn in a uniform manner was a really big problem, both philosophically and physically. Copernicus truly thought that the structure of the universe had to be constructed out of physical spheres that obeyed Aristotle's celestial physics, and so he wants to build a model of the cosmos that represented that presumed reality. At some point, he realizes, I think, that there's no way to do that, and so he goes looking for another solution. Now, we don't know if he reads the arguments of Buridan or Oresme about the possibility of a turning Earth, or if he comes into possession of some of the work done by later Islamic astronomers, most notably Ibn al-Shatir, though there is some pretty strong circumstantial evidence that that might have been at some point the case. However, we know that between 1503 and 1513, he decided to try the solution of Aristarchus. This is where I imagine that the beauty of an idea began to take hold. So given this, What does Copernicus conclude from his 7 axioms? First, the Earth becomes one of the planets that revolve around the Sun, rather than those planets all revolving around the Earth. The Moon is the only heavenly body that does revolve around the Earth, thus separating the Moon from those other wandering stars. This, at its most basic essence, redefines what a planet actually is. Prior to Copernicus, a planet is something that changes its position with respect to the stars over the time. Now a planet is something that goes around the Sun. The construction of this model is a bit complicated. To start, you have to think of the Earth on a sphere of its own. The Sun is near the center of that sphere, but slightly offset to one side, just like the eccentric of Ptolemy's model. Next, each planet has a sphere that is centered on the Sun. On the sphere, there's a small epicycle that turns with the same rate of revolution as the big sphere does, and to which the planet is attached. This produces a sort of oblong motion of the planet through space that was first shown by Apollonius way back in the 3rd century BCE. In this model, that small epicycle, therefore, then takes the place of the equant in producing motion that looked non-uniform from the perspective of an observer on the Earth. In total, it turns out that the model has some 36 different or separate moving parts, a fact that gives lie to the later claim that Copernicus's model was less complicated than Ptolemy's. While it was true that some of the calculations were easier to make, this was due in large part to better calculational tools provided by Regiomonte and later a mathematician by the name of Rheticus. Second, the Earth rotates on its own axis once every 24 hours, and the outermost sphere that contains the stars is now immobile. This gives rise to the nightly motion of the sky. At the time of the publication of the Commentariolus, Copernicus knew he still had to take into account the fact of precession and that incorrect observation of trepidation we talked about briefly, which is a changing of the rate of precession. Now, he assumed he could do this better than what was being talked about at the time by using a rotating Earth that had a wobbling axis in some way. By this time, in the other sort of description, additional spheres had been added to the Ptolemaic model to try to sort of create or model the motions of precession and trepidation, and he realized that he could explain them if he allowed the Earth's rotation axis to wobble like a spinning top. In order to do this accurately, though, Copernicus would have to work out very precisely what that wobble was like by measuring the dates and times of the equinoxes and solstices, something he would do over the course of about 10 years. Third, the revolutions of the outer planets now would take much longer than Ptolemy thought. Copernicus asserts that the tropical periods of the planets are the time of each planet's revolution, about 30 years for Saturn, 12 for Jupiter, 2 for Mars. The Earth takes 1 year, Venus 9 months, and Mercury 3 months. This is actually one of the most startling pieces of the work, as we'll discuss in a moment. Finally, the universe is profoundly larger than previously believed, with the sphere of the fixed stars so far away as to make, quote, distance from the Earth to the Sun imperceptible in comparison with the height of the firmament. Now, there are 3 consequences of this arrangement that sort of fall out very naturally. The first is retrograde motion. As we've said in previous episodes, whatever model you have has to be able to explain why the planets undergo this looping motion in the sky over the course of weeks or months. Aristotle's model couldn't produce the motions, and Ptolemy did it with epicycles that were fairly large when compared to the deferents that were centered near the stationary Earth. For Copernicus, the behavior now comes from the fact that the planets are going around the Sun at different speeds. So as the Earth passes another planet, or is passed by another planet, there is this period of time when the planet looks like it's going backwards. One way to imagine this is to think of yourself as sitting in the passenger seat of a car traveling down a highway going, say, 60 miles an hour. If you observe the motion of the car traveling in the same direction as you are, but that's only going 55 miles an hour, you'll notice that an interesting thing occurs as you overtake the other vehicle. As you are first approaching that slower vehicle, when you observe its motion relative to things out on the distance on the horizon, the car will look like it's going forward. However, as you overtake that other car, the car will seem to go backwards with respect to those distant objects until you get far enough ahead that when the car is far enough behind you, it will once again look like it's moving forward. Copernicus says that this is what is responsible for retrograde motion. Now, this can be a little hard to imagine, so if you're struggling with the idea, we'll put a picture that shows this as well as a link to an animation of it on our website, thescientificodyssey.typepad.com, so you can see how retrograde motion is really just an artifact of the relative motion of two bodies going around the sun at different speeds. In Copernicus's model, there is no true looping motion of the planets through space. Instead, retrograde motion, again, is a result of how we perceive the relative motion of each planet with respect to our observation point. The second thing that falls out is that he can now explain the phenomenon of maximum elongation of the inferior planets and retrograde motion always being at opposition for the superior planets. Again, these are just consequences of the natural configuration of the planets around the sun. Maximum elongation occurs simply because the orbits of Mercury and Venus are closer to the sun than ours are. They physically can't be on the opposite side of the Earth from the sun. Hence, they have a maximum distance from the sun they can be. For the superior planets, retrograde motion takes place as the Earth overtakes those planets with orbits that are outside that of the Earth. This always happens when the planet is opposite the sun from the Earth, and so retrograde motion always takes place at opposition. Hence, all of the strange coincidences of the Ptolemaic system are more easily explained as a simple consequence of Copernicus's arrangement of the planets around the sun. The third and final piece here is that Copernicus can settle the debate as to the order of the planets just by looking at their tropical periods, i.e. the time it takes for each planet to go once around the sky. The shorter a planet's tropical period, the closer to the sun it is. Now, there are a few historians of science who suggest that this third thing was actually the driving motive behind Copernicus's work. The idea is that he wanted to sort out the order so that astrology could be done correctly, that thing we sort of talked about earlier. There is, however, very little support for such an idea among the members of the academic community in the history of science. More likely, he was probably pleased that his model would solve this problem, something he recognized after the fact. I can imagine that as he realized this was one of the outcomes of his system, there was this real sense of excitement that came over him as he realized how this could be thought of as confirmation of his idea. So what's the next step? Well, we don't actually have much in the sense of concrete evidence of how the short work was received at the time. From later correspondence between other astronomers and astrologers, it seems that the manuscript was shared, and that as it was done, it gained some level of notoriety, and Copernicus's reputation among the scientific community grew fairly substantially. Thus, it's likely that Copernicus received enough positive feedback from his friends and colleagues in Northern Europe that he continued to pursue the work, a task that would occupy the spare moments of his life for the next 25 years. At this point, Copernicus the scientist seems to sort of disappear. We have a number of records related to his work as a canon in the region, but nothing that really speaks to his efforts in astronomy, other than a few purchases he made that would likely have gone to creating spaces to observe and work, and a rather scathing review in 1524 of the work of another astronomer who attempted to explain precession. It's clear from the review that Copernicus is working well within his heliocentric paradigm, even if he doesn't come out and just say it. So what else is he doing during this time? Well, his day job, for one thing. Copernicus seems to have taken his responsibilities pretty seriously. We'll talk a good bit more about these things in the biographical episode, but his position as part of the administration of Varmia and the surrounding area took a lot of his time. When he did have some spare time, it's likely that he was working on an expanded manuscript to add the necessary details to his heliocentric model. The Commentariolus was an interesting introduction, but it lacked the mathematical work needed to support it. And that mathematical work needed to be based on real observations of the motions of the planets. There's that old saying in science that many a beautiful theory are slain by an ugly fact. Copernicus understood that no matter how well his theory restored the universe back to Aristotelian motions in some sense, if the model couldn't produce what was seen in the heavens, it was going to be worthless. Therefore, he set out to do two things. First, he had to rigorously work out all the mathematics to support the model so that it gave the right motions, especially with regards to precession. The mathematics that required that certain parameters be input into the various expressions. For planetary motion, these parameters were obtained through observations of the actual planetary positions in the night sky, specifically at certain points, the times of opposition, conjunction, and something known as quadrature, when a planet was 90 degrees away from the sun in the sky. Given Copernicus's location on the shore of the Baltic Sea, these weren't easy observations to get due to the long periods of cloudy weather and the winds that would be jostling his instruments. Moreover, due to the low height of the ecliptic at his latitude, it was very hard for him to get any good observations of the planet Mercury. The day job wasn't the only thing, though. The other was a seeming fear of just being embarrassed due to poor work. Throughout this period, it seems that he was filled with doubt as to whether his work was good enough to share with the broader astronomical community. Therefore, he kept working at creating better mathematical expressions, producing more tables and calculations, and accumulating more data, which, to be honest, was not of particularly high quality. By the late 1430s, the manuscript that contained all the work he had done over the past 3 decades was over 400 pages long. Had not a new impetus entered the picture at this point, it's likely that he never would have published it due to his inability to keep tinkering with the model. That impetus came in the person of George Joachim Rheticus, and we'll need to spend just a few minutes getting him from his place in Wittenberg to Frombork in 1539. By the mid-1530s, things were tense in Copernicus's part of the world. The leadership in the semi-autonomous province had changed, and there were aspects of Copernicus' personal life that were objectionable to that new leadership. A much bigger issue, however, had to do with events 20 years earlier to the south in Germany. In 1517, of course, Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to the door at the church in Wittenberg, and after a few years of back and forth, had been excommunicated from the Catholic Church, and then had been given asylum by the King of Saxony, which is what got the Protestant Reformation underway. By 1538, Wittenberg had established a Protestant university and had named a shockingly young but brilliant mathematician to one of the 2 professorships in mathematics and astronomy there. This young man was George Joachim Rheticus, and in 1538 he was sent by the rector of the university, Luther's minister of education and right-hand man, to Nuremberg to meet with a number of individuals there to further his education. While there, he met a printer by the name of Johann Schooner. Schooner was an entrepreneur who aggressively sought out the next best texts published, and when the group there in Nuremberg heard that Copernicus had a manuscript that contained the basis for what appeared in the Commentariolus, they sent Rheticus to Frombork to assess it and see if it could be published. Rheticus would spend the next 2 years with Copernicus, first learning the manuscript, and then, after getting the older man's permission, writing a summary of it and getting it published through a press in Gdansk. This work, known as the Narratio Prima, or First Account, was put out in 1540 as an open letter to Schooner. Running about 100 pages long, it summarized the larger manuscript elegantly, if non-mathematically. This work is really important for one very specific reason. It allowed Copernicus a little distance from his work. If the narratio was poorly received, he could put his manuscript away and let Rheticus take the heat. If the report received praise, Copernicus could then think about going forward with publishing his larger manuscript. Here again, we see Copernicus's fear of embarrassing himself in some public way. Fortunately, the narratio was very well received, and soon Copernicus was bombarded with letters urging him to publish the full manuscript. In response, he wrote to Pope Paul III expressing the concern that he would be, quote, hooted off the stage, end quote, if he published. In response, the pontiff also urged the manuscript's publication. When, in 1542, the published work appeared, it was dedicated to the Pope and contained with it letters of support from Cardinal Nicolas Schönberg and Bishop Tiedemann Gase. And this speaks to another misconception that you often find with the story, that of the opposition of the Catholic Church to the publication of a heliocentric model of the universe. As can be seen, there was a good deal of interest by the Church at this point in the ideas of Copernicus. It wouldn't be until 1616 that the work would be placed on the list of restricted books, and then only partially. This, however, is part of a later portion of our narrative, so let's leave it until then. Another amusing note associated with this has to do with the language Copernicus used in his letter to the pontiff. Historian of science Owen Gingrich did a little digging to find the specific Latin used for the phrase that we translate as hooted from the stage. Turns out that the word is explodendum, which is where we get our word explode. This latter word, which means to blow up with a loud noise, doesn't actually come into use until around 1700. There is an anecdote related to Werner Heisenberg, which I believe has relevance here. The Nobel Prize winner was asked during an interview in the 1950s how it was that he had created the quantum revolution. In response, Heisenberg said something along the lines of, "To create a revolution, you change as little as possible." The publication of Copernicus's opus, De Revolutionibus Orbem Celestium, or On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, represented the last stage of a revolution that had been brewing for at least 35 years since the dissemination of the Commentariolus. It's a dense text filled with lots of mathematics and tables. Some historians claim that with the earlier publication of the Narratio Prima, most people skipped the work, leading to it being called the book nobody read. Owen Gingrich, however, through a painstaking effort of tracking down every known copy of the first and second editions of the Revolutionibus, has shown that this is simply false. While there were those who did acquire a copy for vanity's sake, a larger number were used by practicing astronomers who frequently got together with others to share notes about the book. Rheticus arranged with Schöner to publish the work in 1541, and then had to take his leave of Copernicus to assume his teaching responsibilities. Shortly after returning to Wittenberg, he was offered a much more prestigious position at Leipzig and had to turn over oversight of the publishing process to a local clergyman by the name of Andreas Osiander. Osiander was well versed in both Greek and Latin, and he had a more than passable understanding of mathematics and astronomy, and so he was well qualified to assist Schöner in the completion of the project. Osiander, however, was also something of a conservative in terms of his thinking about the heavens, and so objected to the realist picture of Copernicus. As such, without anyone's knowledge, he slipped in a preface that took the instrumentalist position that the models and mathematics contained within the text were put forward merely as a way of making calculation easier. This, of course, was absolutely not what Copernicus had thought about his work, nor was it authorized or supported by either Rheticus or others who had worked with Copernicus to prepare the manuscript. They were furious and demanded the printer reprint the entire book run without the offending foreword. In this effort, they were unsuccessful, however. What Copernicus thought of the addition is unknown, as in 1542 he suffered a debilitating stroke that confined him to his deathbed. The story goes that in May of 1543, likely long after he had the intellectual capacity to really understand it, he was finally able to see a copy of his book and then died shortly thereafter. The work of Nicolas Copernicus was the spark that would begin the scientific revolution, but it should be understood that he was both a brilliant revolutionary and a staunch conservative. In his mind, he changed only one thing in switching the positions of the Earth and the Sun. In doing so, however, he saw himself as moving back closer to the Aristotelian view of celestial mechanics and restoring a more unified physics and astronomy. However, in making that one change, he opened the door to one more, and then another after that, and then another, until the views of Aristotle in astronomy and natural philosophy were finally consigned to the trash heap of history by a British mathematician some 150 years later. In our next episode, I'd like to spend some more time getting to know the man a bit better, as well as the amazing and ultimately tragic story of his one student. Between now and then, if you've been enjoying the show and haven't already done so, why not subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, or whatever service you happen to use. That way, you'll automatically get new episodes as we release them. Also, if you have a few minutes, we'd sure appreciate it if you could leave us a strong review on whatever site you're using to listen. It helps us to get the word out about the show. Also, if you'd like to keep up with some of the things we're following in the realm of science news, like our Facebook page. It's where we post links to things that strike our fancy from time to time. Finally, be sure to check out the Blue Dot Sessions. They've been kind enough to let us feature their compositions as part of our soundscape here, and we think you'll like a lot more of what they've recorded. You can find them at www.sessions.blue. As always, thanks for listening, and remember, be kind to those around you. It's a tough old world out there, and we lab rats need to stick together. Until next time, full sails on your journey.